Hello everyone. So in this video we will see what is JWT token and how you can do this token based authorization in web-based transactions, right? Like these API endpoint calls and all the client server relationships. Okay, so let me try to simply explain what actually happens. Okay, so in traditional methodologies, okay, in normal ways, okay, before the JWT token, what has been used in this client server transaction is a session token, let's say. Okay, right. So what happens with the session tokens is, so sorry guys, it's not called session token, it's called session ID. Okay, so what happens with the session ID is, first I will tell how the session ID is being used and then the JWT tokens. So before anything else, we should know why these things are needed. Since JWT token, session ID and everything. Okay, so let's say you are trying to log in into Google, okay, using your Gmail. Okay, I'm just saying it may not be the exact way it is. How do you log in? You give your username and password, right? As a client, username and password. Then once you logged in, you are trying to access something. Let's say you are trying to get your photos, or you are trying to delete the data from your account, things like that. So every time you are doing it, you are sending a network call, right, as a client. Okay, so this Google Gmail, when you log in, you give the username and password, but when you are going to get your photos or deleted data, it is sending a separate network call. So it has to authorize you again and again, okay, who is this guy, or whether he can get these photos, or whether he can delete a particular record. So for that, it always needs your username and password, okay, so that it can log in and make sure he's the guy. So let's say Jack, so he's Jack because his username is correct and password is correct. So let's show him the photo. So let's delete the data from his account. So but for doing that, you have to send the username and password every times. Okay, so that will be a pain to you, right? You don't do normally like that, right? Even though you are doing it correct, you don't send the username and password every time. You have to, but actually, so that is an issue, right? User is getting bored, okay, getting tired. What is this? Every call, network call, I send these things. Okay, so for that only, or to resolve this issue, they have come up with the session ID and JWT token solutions. So first let's start what the session ID does. Okay, so that you don't have to give your username and password or credentials every time when you go for a network call or whatever it is. Okay, when you go for get or delete or post or whatever. Okay, so let me draw. Okay, let's say this is client. Okay, or the user. Okay, client. Okay, CLI means clients. Okay, so this is the server, this is Google. Forgive me for my drawing because you know it's hard with the paint. Okay, this is server. Then first time you try to log in. Okay, so you send your username and password in the Google interface, right? Username and password. Okay, then let's say Google has a database, okay, where it does this verification. It takes your username and password and see whether both are correct or not, okay, in the database or table, and it says okay, he is passed, he is existing, he is the correct user and correct password. Okay, and Google say okay, he is authenticated, the user is fine. Okay, then what Google does is it will say or Google or whatever the server, it will say, oh, maybe Google is not doing the exact thing. Okay, I'm just saying Google as an example. It will say okay, I have to give him a session ID, okay, because he doesn't have to come again and again with the username and password. So it will create a session ID, some secret key value, let's say A10, okay, C253, something like that number. Okay, a very big number, like 15 digits or 16 digits, something like that number. Okay, it creates a session ID And also while it's creating the session ID, let's say it has another table in database. In this database it will see, okay, he is authorized, okay, and I have created a session ID for him. Let's add both here, okay, and it will say, okay, he is the username, this is the username, and maybe he will have an ID for now, maybe user ID, okay, user ID, and this is his session ID. I will type as SID, session ID, and maybe it can have another thing as his role. Maybe he's, I'm just saying he's admin. Google doesn't have those things maybe, but let's say his role is admin. That means he can do specific things. If his role is user, he may not do everything, he can do only some things. Okay, so the role is user or admin, all these things are assigned. Okay, this session ID also added here. Okay, something like that, just think like that. Okay, now once you Google added it, what it will do is it will return you, okay, it will return you the session ID, okay, and it will say, okay, to the server or client, okay, this is a session ID, keep it with you, you will need it hereafter every time you send us a request. Okay, you don't have to type username and password, so keep it. Or you can think your browser can keep the session ID or something like that, and hereafter let's say you are sending your network calls. Okay, let's say you are trying to get some photos or deleted data, you are trying to do such things. Okay, let's say now I am trying to access my photos. Okay, so now I'm sending another request to Google or Gmail or whatever. Now I am sending a get request, right, because I am trying to access my photos. Let's say this is get request along with my session ID. Okay, session ID. Okay, session ID is stored in the browser because it is a temporary ID, so nothing wrong in storing it. It may have some expiry time, after that it will expire. Okay, so it may, right, so nothing wrong, it can be stored because it is not like username password. You can't store your username and password, right, but you can store the session ID. Every time it will go and bring it back. Okay, maybe you can log out, the session ID may be expired after that, or you can you know, so that it cannot be reused again. Okay, next time you log in you will get a new session ID, so it's safe to keep it in the browser side or client side. So now let's say you are sending it with the get the session ID. Now Google gets the session ID, or the server gets the session ID and also the get endpoint, and it will come and check the session ID in this table. Okay, okay, he will find the session ID, and maybe along with the session ID some of the user data may be also sent. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, just don't worry. So then it will check the user, okay, user ID, and okay, role admin, okay, and it will find, okay, he's an admin or he's a user and session ID is correct. Then okay, he's the user and the user ID, role is fine, everything is fine, so it will go to the database. So there's still a question whether I'm not sure the user data, the user or user roles will be coming back through this. I think it will not be, but I'm not sure about that, right? I accept that. Anyway, try to understand the full architecture, even though this is a confusing part that I was saying is not clear to me, even though try to get the full picture of what is happening here. Then since it is verified here, session ID is passing, that means he has the correct session ID, that means he is the correct user. Okay, now he is verified because I gave the session ID, Google gave the session ID, and Google what will do is it will have another table where it can have the person's username and his photos. Now since you are verified with the session ID, Google may return you the photos that you have requested since you are verified. Okay, so this is how the session ID works. Okay guys, so we will continue this from the next video guys.